You're watching News Now from Fox. I'm Daytona Everett. I'm joined now by Jessica Levinson. She's an election law expert from Loyola Law School. Jessica, thanks for joining us.
Oh, thanks for having me back.
Okay, so we talked a little bit earlier, but listen, things are changing hour by hour. We're talking about Trump lawsuits. What is the latest and what can we be looking forward to?
Yeah, I think the latest right now is that the Trump legal team has won 2 of these lawsuits, has lost 32. This, of course, could change, as you said, minute by minute, hour by hour. But I think at this point, we're kind of seeing these lawsuits wind down. The Trump legal team, of course, with a 2-to-32 ratio, has not seen much success. I think that's largely because they just have not come forward with the evidence that's needed in order to support their claims. So what we're looking for kind of right now in the short term is that there's a different political argument that's being made. President Trump is meeting with people in Michigan, ostensibly to try and exert some pressure on them to say, maybe we shouldn't certify the election in Michigan, or maybe the legislature should send its own slate of electors. I think we're going to see this type of thing, these issues, for another maybe 10 to 14 days. The real thing to look for will be December 8th under federal law is the so-called safe harbor deadline. That's the deadline by which states are supposed to resolve all of their electoral college disputes. And if they do certify by December 8th, Congress has to accept their slate. So in terms of kind of how bumpy is this going to be leading up into the inauguration, we're going to know a lot more based on what happens December 8th.
So for people who don't understand the process of this, what does getting certified mean state by state?
Yeah, this is a good question. And this is something we don't typically talk about because usually this whole process is really pro forma. I mean, usually what happens is that everybody votes on election day. We know pretty quickly how things are going to turn out. We know what the electoral college vote's going to be, and we're not watching and fighting in the way that we are this time around. So now we're getting totally different education about what certification. So to answer your question, I mean, what's happening right now is that all of the states are finishing their counts or recounts, and then they have to certify their results. They have to say to the person in charge of the state, this is where we came out. We're going to send either the Trump-Pence slate or we're going to send the Biden-Harris slate. Most states will certify, meaning we're all done, we're comfortable with the results before December 8th. But federal law says things might get messy, you might have some challenges. We're going to give you until December 8th. And as long as states basically figure everything out by that date, then when the Electoral College, members of the Electoral College actually vote on December 14th, and when those votes are sent to Congress to be certified on January 6th, Congress really doesn't have any discretion other than to accept the votes. Again, as long as you certify by December 8th. If we blow past that December 8th deadline, then we're in the arena of kind of election law professor fever dreams. Then we're in the, will there be 2 slates of electors sent? What's going to happen? Will Congress trash some electoral college votes and just not count a state? I don't expect that to happen at this point, but it's 2020. We should be careful about expectations.
Sure. Let's talk about Georgia really quickly because everyone's kind of focusing on this state right now. There was already a hand-done audit that happened, and Georgia's Secretary of State said, okay, we've finished with that. We are ready to certify. Now, the latest development is that President Trump and his legal team are pursuing litigation against the state. Can you kind of explain what's going on there and what they are going to be looking forward to in the future, the state of Georgia?
Yeah, I think that the state of Georgia will be certified. It's important for people to know that when it comes to recounts, they very, very, very rarely change the outcome of any race. Usually you see maybe a few hundred votes here or there changed. In Georgia, there was a hand recount, and really we have to thank the members of the elections board, the people who volunteer to do these recounts and the people who oversee them, because this is thankless work and they did it very quickly. and they certified the results, or are going to certify the results for former Vice President Joe Biden. In terms of the legal challenges at this point, I don't really see that there's been a law that's violated or evidence supporting that type of allegation. I think this is more part of a political strategy, but not necessarily a winning legal strategy. Again, for a winning legal strategy, you need evidence that a certain statute has been violated, that there was a problem with the integrity of the electoral process, that people observed things that were problematic, that there's some evidence of voter fraud. And to date, that hasn't been presented.
Yeah. Well, correct me if I'm wrong, but the audit that was just done, it was hand done. I think the difference would be that the recount would be done through a machine this time around, right?
Right. I think that's correct. And I don't expect, as again, we typically don't expect that results would change. With the same thing, we're looking at Wisconsin, where I believe President Trump's legal team is going to request at least some recounts. And that's quite expensive. I think it's going to cost about $8 million. That isn't necessarily money well spent, because history indicates that we're just not going to see a big enough change. I think probably the punchline for your viewers is, even if Wisconsin flips, which I don't expect that it will, that doesn't change the outcome of the race. We still need to keep our eyes on the Electoral College votes, which at this point stands at 306 for former Vice President Biden. You, of course, need 270. So at this point, we would have to have strange things happen in a lot of states.
Yeah. And in a situation like Michigan is in right now, and in kind of a deadlock, what does that mean for the future of Michigan?
So yeah, Michigan, there's been a lot of discussion, a lot of conflict in Michigan. The question for Michigan will be, can they certify by December 8th? Again, that safe harbor deadline in federal law. And if they can't, then we are in kind of a weird election law hypothetical, because at that point, the question will be, will the Republican-controlled legislature try and send the Trump-Pence slate of electors to vote in the Electoral College? Michigan state law doesn't actually envision a role for the legislature as part of this. But under the federal Constitution, I believe they'll make an argument that they do have a role. At that point, the question is, will the Democratic governor say, absolutely not, I looked at the vote, we're sending the Biden-Harris slate. If two different slates of electors try and vote and are sent to the Electoral College, at that point, it's up to Congress to determine what's going to happen. We are now, I should flag, in uncharted territory. At that point, Congress could potentially just say, we're not counting Michigan this time around. So if there's two slates that are sent, they could say no. They could potentially decide which slate to count. Those are the kind of forks in the road. Those are the potential scenarios. I hope that we avoid that, because that kind of unprecedented constitutional waters tends not to be great.
Sure. Speaking of Congress, let's step back into Georgia. We have a runoff going on for the Senate races out there. Can you explain what that means and what that means going forward for Congress and the Senate specifically, becoming a majority or minority when it comes to Republicans?
Yeah, so the balance of power in the Senate really does hang in the balance when it comes to these two special elections in Georgia. Georgia has been a state that's hard for Democrats to win, but their registration numbers are changing significantly. And so I don't think you can completely count Democrats out. But at this point, I think it's fair to view the Democrats as the underdogs. Now, if it happens based on the results in Georgia that there are 50 Republicans and 50 Democrats in the Senate, then the interesting thing is that the president of the Senate, the person who is the tiebreaker, is the Vice President of the United States. And that, of course, is soon to be former Senator Kamala Harris, at which point, the joke is she'll spend more time in the Senate than she did as a senator. I don't think that that's quite true, but she certainly would have an important role to play if it is deadlocked 50-50. If Republicans win in Georgia, then that won't happen.
All right, here's a real kicker for you. could there be another recount in the Georgia Senate runoff?
Yes, absolutely. So if the races in Georgia are very close, and if under state law, one candidate is entitled to a recount, absolutely, we could have a recount in those later races. Yeah.
So throughout all of this, we've obviously seen President Trump putting up litigation against all of these states, but is it possible that lawsuits are put up against him after, say he does lose the election and he's back to just normal life?
Absolutely. So at this point, President Trump could face both federal criminal liability and state criminal exposure. And there's been a lot of discussion about whether or not, for instance, President Trump could pardon himself. We've never in the history of our country seen a self-pardon. We don't know if the Constitution would even allow that. It hasn't been tested before. There is this legal principle where you essentially say no person should be their own judge. And obviously it goes against that particular principle, but the pardon power is really broad. It's important for people to know that presidential pardons only affect federal crimes. They don't affect state crimes. And so you can issue a pardon, and it can be before you're ever charged, before somebody's ever charged, before they are ever convicted. It can be prospective. What would we be looking at? There have been discussions about things like obstruction of justice, campaign finance violations, perhaps, maybe not from the president, but from members of his family. And then on the state level, only a governor can pardon you for state crimes. And we know that in Manhattan, a prosecutor has been pretty actively pursuing potential crimes against President Trump, the Trump organization, dealing with things like bank fraud, tax fraud, insurance issues. And so none of those would go away with a pardon. What's important for President Trump is that for the federal crimes, if there is no pardon, he can still be charged with these crimes because the statute of limitations on a lot of these crimes is about 5 years. And that even if a crime was committed in 2016, he can still be charged in 2021. If he stayed in office, the statute of limitations probably would have run, and so he could not have been charged with most of these federal crimes.
Stepping forward, like we just want to mind everyone who's watching right now, things are literally changing minute by minute. It's hard to track these lawsuits that are going on right now, but with your best prediction, what do you see as the future for this election and all the states getting certified and whatnot?
So my best guess, and of course it's difficult to guess, but my best guess is that we don't see a case that goes up to the Supreme Court. If there's one state where we have to be kind of careful about that prediction, it's Pennsylvania. There are late arriving ballots that have still been subject to some legal wranglings. The question there is really a pretty detailed one. It's whether the Pennsylvania Supreme Court is the last word on Pennsylvania state law, meaning could the Pennsylvania Supreme Court say, under our reading of the state law, it's okay to allow ballots to come in even later than we had planned? Or is it just the Pennsylvania legislature that could make that change? That's a legal question where at this point, I think it still is a question mark in the Supreme Court, but we don't know if that case is going to make it up to the Supreme Court. Another thing to remember is those late arriving ballots, there apparently are not enough of them to flip Pennsylvania. And even if you flip Pennsylvania, that's not enough to flip the result in the Electoral College. So that's, I think, one of the bigger lingering legal issues, but I don't think it changes the outcome of the presidential election.
All right, all great information right there. Jessica, is there anything else you want to add to this?
This is certainly an unprecedented time. Some of what we've seen, again, from President Trump is not unique to President Trump or his legal team. It's absolutely candidates have the right to ask for recounts. There's nothing strange or unique about that. What's been unique has been, frankly, the amount of litigation and, just to have 34 at this point different election law decisions post-election. That's not something that we're accustomed to at all. And so the question will be, is this an aberration or is this a pattern? What are we going to see in 4 years?
Yeah, and we're seeing, specifically Rudy Giuliani bring up all of these affidavits that he says exist across the country. Is that pretty typical for lawsuits like this or atypical?
I'm going to give you a really unsatisfying answer, which is these types of lawsuits are not typical, period. So the typical thing, of course, is that if you sue, you would have evidence to come forward. You would have affidavits, you would have other documentary evidence. In terms of the affidavits, to date, both judges who are appointed by Democrats and judges who are appointed by Republicans, federal judges, state court judges, have not really found that these affidavits would be enough in order for these legal claims to succeed. Right now, where we are is the Trump legal team saying there's evidence forthcoming. We're going to show, but we haven't seen that evidence that would be enough to prove these claims.
Sure. All righty, Jessica Levinson out there in Loyola Law School. We appreciate your expertise. You are just so detailed in your explanations, and it's hard to kind of understand all of this that's going on right now. So thank you for breaking it down.
Thank you for allowing me to do a crash course in election law. I appreciate it.